It's officially springtime. Greetings to listeners around the world.
This is the Almost Daily ZenCast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
Hello, namaste, greetings and salutations, dear friends. It is a lively spring morning this Monday, April 5th, 2021. We live in the future, and we still... Oh, I ruined what I was going to say. What was I going to say? I decided to try to work in this living in the future thing right at the last second. I don't know what I was thinking. Two statements. A, the future is now, and that's a mind-blowing thing. The other statement is B, Mother Nature is still quite lively and thriving around us, despite our best efforts to commodify the shit out of her blood and bones and pollute ourselves into a toxic dystopia. Where to begin with today's show? To be quite honest, friends, I have no idea. There is so much going on in the world. From the fomenting civil unrest in places like Myanmar, the ongoing brutal civil and or proxy wars like in Yemen and Syria. We've got the very emotional and socially significant murder trial of former police officer Mr. Derek Chauvin going on. That's probably resuming, if not currently, right this hot second, probably within the next hour or so. I always get confused because East Coast, West Coast time throws me for a loop, right? Dear flat earthers, if the world is flat, why do time zones make sense? They're confusing, but they make sense. You know, like you call someone in New York and it's that time of day over there and it's this time of day over here and they can show you on the video thing. You call the other side of the planet when it's nighttime over there. It's nighttime over there. I don't know. Not that I want to get into a flat earth versus globe earth argument. That's not what today's episode is about at all. For those of you who are interested, I've already done a big episode where I discuss this issue. And my bottom line is that technically speaking, in terms of whether or not I'm going to pick up either of those two things as ideologies, I'm not. Because both of them, broadly speaking, although there are occasional exceptions as interpreted by individuals or small groups of people that are like, no, we get what you're saying. But that still doesn't really make the rest of it palatable because they're still basically behaving the same way, even though they're acknowledging this one thing. But both, essentially, to get to this really quick bottom line, as far as flat earth versus globe earth goes, both models are critically missing a really important aspect or ingredient or jigsaw puzzle of the whole image. And therefore, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate the rest of their parameters are, they fail, and I'm not interested, you know? And it's this, I'm not trying to be mysterious. Like, this place is alive, yo. It's a living being in and of itself. So both models radically ignore that. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, both models are wrong. Give me a model that attempts to accurately describe the cosmos that begins with the acknowledgement that it is alive. Not just this planet, but the totality of it, right? That it is a living being in and of itself, and that we are but leaves on a little twig of a sidebar of a branch over on one splinter of a cluster of, growth over here off this side trunk. That was a horrible tree analogy. I apologize. I digress. Where are we? What are we talking about today? I'm not sure. Today feels like a marked, very strongly delineated day of transition for me. And I'm not entirely clear why. It's more of a vibe that I feel, of a sensation that I'm registering. I sort of am not a huge fan of these words, but like an intuitive, we need better language, but that's a whole nother episode. This past weekend was epic, for myself personally, in a very anticlimactic sort of way, I think. In as much as that I just feel I had a lot of personal journey going on as I did whatever else I was doing this weekend. It's also an interesting, fascinating weekend. Quite the moment in time and history. The anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. The anniversary of the assassination of an individual that we identify with the name Jesus Christ. And I think I did a really horrible job of explaining this one bit yesterday on my... Was it yesterday or the day before? Whenever I did the Easter special, yesterday feels forever away. I can't explain why. I guess I just had I've been having very weird sleep patterns expressing themselves. Like lately, in the most recent collection of days, I've been waking up at like 4 a.m, which is fine. I don't mind. But that's a whole nother story I can get into, but I won't. I'm out of control here. Let's focus. This one bit that I think I failed to explain yesterday, or whenever I did the Easter special, and I kept saying the phrase, the person we identify with the name Jesus. That podcast left me in a bit of a mood. I really did want to come back and do 2 or 3 more segments like I did on Christmas. But I also sort of wasn't feeling up to it at a performative level. Like some days you don't feel like doing 3 shows in a row. And when it's a touring show, you kind of have to, or you, if you haven't abused it, you turn to your understudy. In this situation, since I don't have to drive somewhere, I'm not clocking in, someone else isn't paying me for the hours, I can just step out whenever I want, which is, of course, probably problematic for the growth of the show, but neither here nor there. I keep spiraling out of control from the thing I want to talk about. I was left in a mood because I really wanted to talk more, because I felt like I've done, in that particular episode, I did a really sort of paltry job of explaining my relationship and my intellectual understanding of who/what we indicate with the name Jesus Christ. And the reason I use that sort of language, I prefer to point it out that way, is because as I said before, I was raised in the Catholic system, and I was a bit of a rebel intellectual child. I didn't emotionally rebel very much in my life, in my youth growing up. I think I did more of that on my own as an adult. But intellectually, I was quite rebellious and curious and questioning everything. Because that's one of the earliest things I came across in a worldly way. The first bit of philosophy I think I ever encountered as a very young child. Question everything. And for better or worse, I took it very deeply to heart. After 30 plus years of questioning everything and having a fascination with both the historical personage as we understand that as inheritors of history and content, which must be questioned, right, and thoroughly examined. Arguably has been done and, asked and answered, but also arguably a never-ending struggle because the next generation inherits the bundle of data and has to, question it for themselves, right? That's why you never stop questioning. Having said all that, what I'm trying to get to is that I think we need to disambiguate, we need to clarify between the postmodern images of the person / demigod / mythological superhero. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. I'm not a cynical atheist casting out all of the content as pure, vapid imagination. I'm not. I tried that hat on, right? So I want it to be understood by anybody listening that I have intellectually gone through multiple stages, multiple phases of testing and counter-testing, questioning and counter-questioning. And to the point of atheism, I've been there. I've put that hat on. I've tried it on. I've tried to believe that. Came to many conclusions, which I can talk about at some other point. I'm doing a terrible job of it again. What am I trying to explain? There's the man that we indicate with the name Jesus Christ, right? I believe, and I really do loathe that term. I rarely use it. But after 30 years of curiosity and seeking and exploring and reading and asking questions, and by no means do I claim that I've done this at a professional level. I've done it to the best of my ability as an average, ordinary, everyday Joe Schmo on the street. Never mind the bit about being a cybernetic, artificial, replicant life form from another dimension, here to warn you about the robots and other possible alternative endings to your future. That's got nothing to do with it, right? I'm just an average, ordinary, everyday Joe Schmo on the street. So, I acknowledge that there might be information out there that I haven't gotten my hands on that may radically change my perspective. But what I'm trying to get to and keep spiraling out of control about is this. And forgive me, I had to cough there. There is the individual that lived the lived experience that we now have many stories and many interpretations to those stories about. And we do not actually know that person's name. It might have been Yeshua. It might have been something like Yeshua. I tend to lean towards the theory that might have also been a formal, ritual name. And then he might have had an entirely different other name. That question's not as critical to me. But I do like to call that out because it's important in my mind to recognize that there was a person likely. And I know there's a whole bunch of arguments against it, and I've been there. Like I said, I've put on the atheist hat. I've put on the maybe Jesus doesn't exist at all hat. And I've come full circle back around to something happened, and there must be a rational explanation that opens the door to welcoming in a bunch of things that we might be unwisely chucking out like babies in bathwater. There's a saying there that comes from the Middle Ages. Look it up. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's because there wasn't plumbing yet, and you still had to get rid of bathwater. And apparently sometimes people left babies in the bath, and then other people came in around not realizing there was a baby in there and tipped the bath out, and the baby got hurt. So, for clarity, Christos wasn't the dude's last name. In fact, from what I understand, in that place, in that time, in that culture that he was raised in, people often didn't use family names. They just sort of went by their name. Like, they were like Madonna, like Matthew. What are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's last names? Nobody knows. Because maybe they didn't really use last names. And it's one of those things that was a cultural thing and that has, varied throughout time and place. But officially and historically, verifiably, Christos was a title that was applied to multiple people. In other words, he wasn't the only Christos. Or he was the only person who received that title. And I think I've heard the argument, although I couldn't cite you sources right now, and that's, right, terrible scholarship. Is that the right term? But I've heard that Yeshua might have also been a sort of formal name that one takes on as part of a role or a recognition of having achieved a certain amount of training, etc. I'm not asserting that as fact at all. I'm just saying it's out there, right? Regardless, based on things I've come across, and mind you, this is important to note because Christians will often react quite negatively to content that actually originates from deep within Christian history because it doesn't ring as familiar to them because it's not discussed anymore. But for those who may or may not be aware, it's really quite true that there's a wide array of Christology, right? Like of the study of Christ and the theorizing, the speculating, the pontificating, the preaching of, the positing, the sharing and debating of theory of Christ. Like what actually happened? Like we know what happened, but what actually happened? Like what does this mean? And from that array, I've come to sort of splice together a couple of things that may or may not have originally gone together and connect them to other theory that I find interesting and fascinating and not in radical disalignment, in total conflict with reality. And so, to get to the point and wrap this up, and I hope one of the other concerns, and this is a sidebar to my own mini sidebar about the last episode, I hope I don't come off as conceited or stuck up about, I feel really comfortable talking about my quite diverse education, autodidactic as it may have been, my own self-taught education about what people have theorized or postulated or stated as articles of faith about the person we identify with the name Jesus Christ. So I'm sharing with you sort of my interpretation, but doing it in a really sort of spirally out of control kind of way. I am of the opinion, and as much as I take that opinion seriously, and I consider it also sort of like my religious worldview, I also acknowledge that religion, like politics, really boils down to our opinion about history and facts and other information, right? That we codify and call belief. But I'm of the belief opinion, I guess. I vote for, to stick to my own language about how the universe works. Put a pin in that if you've never heard me talk about it. Dig up the episodes in which I do. I vote for, with my belief powers of my mind, for the explanation that there are two powers at play when we point to the historical figure we identify as Jesus Christ, right? There's the human being, whoever they were, who had a deep, profound, transformational, spiritual experience of an extreme nature to the point where we might as well call it magic and magical, like divine magic, etc. And that experience directly involved communing with, connecting to, rediscovering, re-inhabiting, to use another phrase. But one form or another, communing with and expressing, living in alignment with, in a full sort of like the song says, letting the light shine, with the Christos as a sort of, if we may borrow a term, a spiritual meta-archon, a consciousness construct that is part and parcel, an organic aspect of the way in which divinity actively pursues the infinitely ongoing process, the event, the phenomena of creation. As you may recall from, I don't know how many episodes ago, I've talked about this before, and I humbly invite you to go dig up these episodes. Like, just go start. I know even sometimes the titles will sound like I'll have nothing to say about spirituality in that episode. You'd be surprised. I spiral way out of control all the time. And in one way, it's how things totally interconnect. So go look that up. So one way I could say it is that the person that we have labeled Jesus Christ was a human mystic that achieved oneness with the Christ mind of the universe. The divine grace that is the child of the unity of consciousness, the singularity that we identify with the term God. Why am I explaining all this? Because I really wanted to get into it yesterday and I didn't. And I said I would come back and I didn't. But here I am today. And I was sitting here at my desk with the show ready to go live in a generic title and a generic blurb. And a really sort of like frightening sensation of not knowing what on earth I was going to talk about. But here we are, 23 minutes in. Boom. I have, and DJ Zed and I have failed to repopulate our playlist with audio entertainment remixed asset tracks for you today. And for that, I apologize. We apologize. I say I because I'm the one who has to do all the actual talking as DJ Zed just sits there in the corner like a lamp. So many thoughts, so many things, so many threads to try and connect. In my cosmology, which is sort of the purpose of this podcast, if you didn't know, like I'm sharing my thoughts about current events, politics, etc., and how they intersect with sort of, well, the various cosmologies that are at play. We have the sort of normative Judeo-Christian world cosmology, which is increasingly getting sublimated into a sort of agnostic world cosmology. And then we have various other competing cosmologies. And like in the same way that I am respectful, but also not inclined to participate in any organized religion, because I am concerned for various reasons that the spiritual system of oppression, not the man-made, although they are the expression of, right? The spiritual system of oppression has worked its dark and shadowy claws, and that there's a lot of healing to be done. Easter is, as we were, exploring in the last segment, one of those weird holidays. That if you take a survey, people think they kind of are familiar with it, but you drill down and you surprise them with how much they may or may not truly have looked into. For example, I mean, there's so many like I was saying in the last episode, there's so many fascinating things that have been explored in a serious and meaningful way as theories to further explain the phenomena or the events as described in the biblical record, which is, for better or worse, not exactly historical record. And there's just instead of just teasing me that I should talk about some of those, or I should actually try to draw it all together to make a point. While it's fascinating to get lost and or maybe engage in the argumentation of a lot of these various theories, I think it's slightly more important and maybe possibly more urgent in spiritual terms that we transcend theoretical statements and return to what it is that we believe, is that we all sort of, for everyone, as much as I feel not a welcome member of Christian society, because a lot of Christians would be alarmed at the things that I'm comfortable considering to be also true, alongside of the idea that the person we indicate by the name of Jesus, had a spiritual experience, not a religious one, a spiritual experience, a mystic, divine experience, and a transformative one that elevated him, and probably also Mary Magdalene, because I can't imagine it not happening in pairs. And with humanity having a persistent and malicious need to sort of strike women down from positions of power and erase them from history, I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. This unifying, this communion that they achieved, and not to be too weirdly controversial, we can just focus on Jesus and just not talk about Mary in this episode. It is clear from the evidence available and plenty of other people's academic research into the subject that a much more plausible explanation than some of the dogmatic theology that is developed around Christ's sacrifice and Christ's message overall is that this communion, this unifying with the cosmic Christos, is something that each and every human being has accessible to them deep within. And that resonates deeply to things that the Buddha said and things that other historically preserved teachings from individuals similar to the person we identify by the name of Jesus, that, there seems to be this phenomena throughout history of people realizing that the world is full of suffering and doesn't need to be. The world is full of conflict and doesn't need to be. The world is full of profiteering and doesn't need to be. And the world is full of fighting and war over these things and ideas and ideological constructs built around these things and about these things to control these things etc., etc., etc. And then pursuing spiritual practice, like actively engaging in spiritual practice and experimenting in them like, spiritual scientists, they rediscover, reconnect to, and commune with the divine grace that is inherently hidden, slumbering deep within. And it's fascinating to zoom back out to our postmodern context. It's a deep tragedy to me how effective the reinterpretation of the person and historical figure of Jesus has become. It's everywhere from, not only did they, however long ago, centuries ago, whitewash Jesus very literally and sort of abstract him as a historical figure out of and away from his own original origins. If he was indeed born in Bethlehem, we must remember then that means he was forgive me, my brain is just like three other thoughts are colliding with the sentence I'm trying to say, and therefore he's Palestinian born, right? Which is, to some people, a controversial statement to make, especially if they're really tied up in the politics of the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was a dark-skinned, Palestinian-born, mystical practicing, the closest thing to, they probably didn't have the term in their context, but something akin to like a shaman of the Jewish religion, as opposed to a more orthodox officiant, right? And I'm not making things up. There's plenty of academic work into the specific subsect of Jewish tradition that Jesus belonged to. And they were very likely vegetarians. And some of their practices very likely involved entheogenic, spiritual sacred plants. No shock there if you really understand the true historical context at the time. That was common everywhere. To zoom back out, right? Like, we live in a world in which people believe that Trump is the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I'm sorry, but that's so impossible to buy into, it's laughable, right? And I understand the Lord works in mysterious ways. Trust me, I know. And I get it, we're all part of the master plan in spiritual terms. There's just a lot of nonsensical human versions of the plan being peddled as actual versions of the plan, and it's probably not. You know what I'm saying? It's a great tragedy to me, to put a button on the Jesus talk, that for example, not to I don't want to sound self-aggrandizing. I'm really quite humble. I'm humbled by the challenges that my relationship with the historical figure, the mental construct, the spiritual enigma, and the article of faith. These are all different elements of the same complex thing that happens when you invest faith and belief in, and then maybe question and maybe try to walk away from, reject from any kind of figure of religious belief. We sort of often flatten all that out to sort of one thing, right? Belief is a really complex and sophisticated tool set, because it isn't just one blunt instrument, in my opinion. And we've lost our relationship with it because we've flattened it down. We've decontextualized it, and we've turned it into something that it's only about a little bit and made it all that, right? There's nothing more dangerous than unwisely and foolishly giving anything and anyone, any idea, any construct, your blind faith. Because there's a lot of power there. Power you are giving up. Belief has a really interesting root etymology. And in one of its deeper layers, it had a different orientation. It still had to do with like, we sort of essentially have reduced belief today to the acceptance of a statement. That's why it tickled me that, like, I've been asked, do you believe in the Constitution? Well, it exists and I can read it. So, like, do I believe that it's there? Yeah, it's not like I radically disbelieve that it exists. Although that's something that's popular these days, disbelief. The problem with disbelief that people who engage in it willy-nilly and vis-a-vis like manipulation that they kind of overlook is that it is also a form of belief. To disbelieve, to believe in the absence of something or in the negation of something is in and of itself a belief, not necessarily a knowledge. But we can talk about the difference between belief, knowledge, and wisdom in another episode. It's springtime. Spring is upon us. The Easter Bunny has distributed all the Easter eggs. By the way, I haven't shared it on my social media yet, but I need to call out what is now my new all-time favorite Easter Bunny meme. And forgive me if it's been around before in different incarnations. But right now, in this hot moment, this is what I'm feeling. There's a really great meme that's either a really like lifelike drawing picture or a photo that's been sort of arted up to make look artsy. I don't know, but I'm not sure which side of it is, but it's Freud. I think it's Freud or a Freudian-like analyst, right? Sitting, notepad, pen, and a hare, a proper brown, streaky, short-tailed rabbit, but not, a hare. This is technically two different things, but it's neither here nor there for most people nowadays. Rabbits and hares all look the same, and they're all called bunnies. And the presumably the Easter Bunny itself, although it's not made to look big or taller than a person like some Easter bunnies. It's a small, ever so slightly personified, sort of like, what was that rabbit? It was, there was a great children's book back in the day about a small rabbit hare. Anyways, it doesn't matter. The Easter Bunny, in its very like bland, boring, drab, animalistic form, is saying something to the effect of, I don't know where the eggs come from, and I don't understand why I hide them. And that brought so much, joy to my inner child. Because from a very young age, long before I ever saw the Eddie Izzard bit about explaining why the Easter eggs and on Easter, because the chocolate of the eggs is brown, like the wood of the cross, which is a terrible butchering paraphrasing of Eddie Izzard from Dressed to Kill. Don't sue me, Eddie Izzard. I love you. Long before I ever was exposed to that, like back in the day, I was like, what is it with this bunny thing and the eggs? I don't get it. The dude got killed, right? We killed a guy. And we're out here chasing bunnies, I remember from my youth, like, I don't remember which church, but I remember like a side yard, a lawn in front of or to the side of the church, and like it was penned off, like with a little bit of like Animal Farm fencing, and there were rabbits, and you can walk into this penned off sections of grass in small groupings and pet and chase the rabbits around. And then there were other areas where there were Easter eggs hidden. And I was a very young person, and I was very, very clearly aware, like, this dude got pummeled and strung up, and we're commemorating his death as sacrifice for all of our horrible sins. And immediately after talking about that, like, contemplating it, we're chasing bunny rabbits. I don't know why I'm stuck on this image, but I also had a thought earlier. Oh, I haven't watched it yet, but I really, really wish I had a free subscription to the platform that it's on. But is it Neil Gaiman? Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where they totally do like all the different kinds of Jesus. There's like a cowboy Jesus. Am I confusing different shows? But I know there's a show out there. It's either American Gods or another show about like gods and how they might fictionally relate to humans. And there's a popular thesis that long ago became something that gets referenced in spiritual fantasy and science fiction and stuff and whatnot. And I think it originates from like the Olympian gods, right? Like I think they had this critical problem. And it's something that I think the world needs to scientifically investigate. Scientifically, library, nuclear, that's the way they pronounce it wrong. Sorry. We should develop a spirit science. Talked about it before. I don't want to ramble about it now. It's a tragedy to me that Christianity in its many forms has been so negatively impacted by Western culture's obsession with profit, with commodification, with consumerism. It's become long ago. It's new. It was this problem was evident, early on in the history of the Catholic Church when it was the only thing going. They might have invented like hostile corporate takeover. You know what I'm saying? There was once a patchwork of communities of people who shared a common understanding of a spiritual practice taught by someone that, like the Buddha and many others, had achieved communion with the higher realms of divine conscious energies, which unlocked abilities in the human avatar, such as, the miraculous healing, etc. And to me, the tragedy is that there's millions of people who claim to believe this, and yet we aren't really exploring in any meaningful, profound way the actual practices. Many people are caught up in post-Catholic practices and rituals, which not necessarily a bad thing, right? One of the problems with ritual is that it can become outdated and an adherence to ritual that no longer matters, that no longer is effective, that no longer works is silly. We shouldn't do that. As Karen Armstrong points out in her book, which is one of my all-time favorite books on the subject of the development and historical, facts of the big three mainstream organized religions, is that humanity is a spiritual creature and will adopt a new modality of practice if and when it works. And what that means can be very subtle and very intangible. But if it brings comfort, if it brings inspiration, if it brings healing, if it brings motivation, if it brings a sense of connectedness and unity, people will adopt it. And although sometimes slow and sometimes not vigilant enough, people, collectively speaking, will indeed eventually outgrow systems of belief or practice that have fallen apart, that have lost their significance, that have been corrupted, that have been hijacked, that have turned them away from that which is, quote unquote, working. Right? Now, in the 3,000 years of Christian history, arguably, collectively, we failed at that. We failed at that ability to stop and adapt, to abdicate a practice that's become a practice or a organization or an ideological construct that has become toxic. And there's so much more we could talk about there, but I realize as I look up that I've been rambling for quite some time already, friends. I humbly encourage you to come on back, to jump around, and to, especially if you're relatively new to the podcast here, if you're new to the show, and you haven't come across some of the older episodes, especially the segments entitled Unauthorized and Explicit Readings. If you're interested in the weird, nuanced position that I take on, and I'm trying very uneloquently to express in these episodes today, you may find it helpful to go back and visit some of those other episodes where I've talked about it before from other perspectives or from other approaches. At any rate, I'm going to try to live up to my aspirational plan of enacting a more productive day-to-day work cycle and try to do more things in regards to keeping this podcast interesting and engaging, and hopefully finally getting around to updating it, as it were, as I've talked about endlessly forever now. But as always, friends, my humble thanks to you for tuning in. Forgive me if this episode seemed really random or just fixated on going back to and rambling about my weird interpretation of the Christ message. But I think we live in we just had a president who welcomed people to believe that he might be the second coming of Jesus. And we have other things going on in the world, actions being taken, strange events being committed, strange acts being committed by people who believe that so-and-so over there is the second coming of Christ. And ultimately, to really get into a point and just drop it, I think that we can find in the teachings of Christ, especially if we unearth content that brings more clarity and can be verified with some deep authenticity, And if we can eliminate the corruption that has been layered and sort of packed on to the texts, the message there was to go within, right? To connect, that the Christos is accessible within everyone. And that that we can all overcome the darkness or the evil that is also within us all through that kind of work. And maybe, just maybe, the time has come that we rediscover that work. Either through that, like, archaeological dig for texts closer to the era, freer of corruption, and a reevaluation of some of the choices made that have been preserved historically by the church as a sort of like the primary preserver and or corrupter, influencer, changer, disruptor of all of that content. And also, as Jesus points out somewhere, the kingdom is within. As the Buddha points out, he didn't invent something, right? He rediscovered a long known and forgotten path. Ultimately, I think that if we take a big enough view, if we quit all the petty squabbling and the us versus themism and the self-righteousness, and we focus on the unifying themes that transcend across culture, across dogmatic institutions that rose up around these different practices, and we focus on those things not as absolutes that must be believed in absolutely, but as signposts, as wisdom guidance towards creating a living practice that is appropriate for each of us and each of our communities here and now, right? And that transcends the us versus them dynamic. Because, as I meant to talk about earlier, and now I will not jump into a long ramble about now, and I guess I'll just tease it for a future episode. I mean, can you imagine a truly ubiquitous, monolithic Christian nation? Or even worse, a Christian world? A monolithic world of any one of the given established major mainstream organized religions. Would it work? Would it be that religion's utopia? Or, more likely, given the flaws inherent in human society that we have yet to heal, wouldn't that sort of thing be really difficult to impose or really difficult to achieve without some sort of imposition, some sort of use of force? And B, even if it was successfully achieved, a ubiquitous establishment of a singular religion, right? And I don't care which. I think the flaw remains the same. Eventually, if we're talking about one of the religions as we know them now, there's so much us versus themism that has been packed into the content that they would splinter and form us versus them rivalries within their own supposed monolith of belief, and that ultimately you would see groups branching off and challenging one another over different interpretations of the same content. Because when we calcify what is supposed to be a living practice into a rigid structure of ideological constructs, it becomes a mental cage and not a spiritual practice of liberation, which, to the best of my understanding after years of seeking, that's what the genuine and authentic prophets, if we may redefine that term, truly had in common that transcends all of the dogma that's been imposed on it retroactively. But as I was trying to get myself to do earlier, I must put an end to this episode. As always, I humbly thank you for tuning in. I invite you to share your thoughts, your questions. The whole idea of this show was originally was established around the notion of having conversations. And I become much more focused and much less spirally out of control when I have other minds or other voices to counterpoint me, to have conversations with. Since I don't have a co-host as of yet, even though 4 years of sort of half-assedly looking has come, some people, I'm not come close, but I invite you, dear audience, don't be shy. Come on down to Sprecher.com/show/ZenCast. Log in, sign up, tune in. I had a phrase for that. And drop your comments there. And if you don't feel like signing up to that platform, please do come on down to one of my other social media platforms. Instagram, at Mr. Zeppo, no period. Or Facebook. You should be able to find me searching the Almost Daily ZenCast. You can also always email me at the following email address: the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo @gmail.com. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your hearts, my friends. Till next time, be good humans.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.
May the power of Christ transform you. May the power of Christ transform me. May the power of Christ transform all of us. May the power of Buddha do the same. May the power of all the enlightened ones shine in this moment so that humanity may transcend its barbaric and asinine addiction to killing each other over which of the prophets were the most righteous. Because they're all pointing us in the same direction, deep within.